more and learn from each other. Today's session is actually part of our innovative finance community of practice, but because of the importance of this topic, we decided to open the session to the other members of our community. Just for those that are not part of the community of practice, just to let you know a little bit of what have we accomplished and what we have learned throughout our community of practice. We kicked off that community last year. Our first session was to learn about integrated capital, and thanks to Manolo, who I see here in the meeting, we were able to bring RSF Social Finance to tell us how they work this topic. We also had and learned from two of our members who are also here present, who talked about how they're using blended finance to structure deals in Brazil. We also had another member who came, ICE Fundación, who came with a specific problem. And it was a really nice session because it allowed the community to support him in his problems, trying to find a solution to his problem. So I really enjoyed that specific session. We then had the Agora partners who explained to us their new financial investing model called Delta model, where they're looking at other ways of finding financing, funding, and in order to support their activities. And it combines philanthropic capital with other innovative structures. We also heard from Tania Rodriguez and Manolo as well from the co-capital team, how they use how they structure their investment model. And then we heard from another community of practice in Brazil of how they're experimenting with, or how they experimented with different financial instruments, and how this was a community of foundations who wanted to explore different innovative finance instruments that went beyond donations. And then that leads us today, where we are very happy to have Roots of Impact talked about impact-linked finance. So what are today's objectives? They are four, I would say. One is to know more about what is impact-linked finance, understand some examples of those instruments. The Roots of Impact will also be sharing, lessons they've learned throughout the process, throughout their experience. And then there's going to be an announcement where there's an opportunity for those who are interested to learn more. There's an opportunity, so we'll make an announcement at the end. So that's more or less the agenda for today. And with that said, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. We have Jorn. He's the CEO and founder of Roots of Impact. Before joining and creating Roots of Impact, he used to work for Credit Suisse. So he's a guy who comes from the financial world. And Patricia, she leads the impact-linked finance programs. And before that, she used to work for UNIDO in the United Nations. And her resume says she speaks 4 languages, but I think it's 5, Patricia, because I've tested your Spanish. So I would add Spanish as your 5th language. So again, both of you, very much welcome to this community of practice. For those who are not part of the community of practice, also very welcome, and let's keep learning. So with having said that, just the last announcement, we also have a next week for those who are interested about learning how 3 organizations are innovating the way they're supporting one of the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically on housing. This is going to be an interesting series where we'll be learning about Dynamo in Brazil, how they use also blended finance to fund remodelation projects. We're going to be learning about company Jordao, how they've been joining with other companies to support innovators and entrepreneurs in finding solutions to construction. And Fundación Santo Domingo in Colombia will be telling us how they work with different public and private sectors to create macro projects on housing. So don't miss that, and that's next week. You can find out more information on our website. So that's all I wanted to say, and again, thank you very much for being here. So Patricia, Bjorn, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Alan. I'm first sharing my screen. Let me know if this works and if you can see the presentation. Fantastic.
Yes.
Great to be here. Thanks a lot for having us. This is about the next frontier of innovative finance. We call it impact-linked finance. We coined this term, I think it was in 2018. And yeah, we want to walk you through. We have plenty of time also for questions, for discussions. Of course, we prepared a few slides, but feel free whenever you like also to put questions into the chat. I will manage the presentation and Patricia will manage the chat. You already introduced ourselves, Alan. Thanks a lot. I will directly dive into the content. Maybe I start, my name is Björn. I start with introducing a little bit Roots of Impact, that you know what we are doing. So Roots of Impact, we are an advisory firm fully specialized on innovative and blended finance, and more specifically on impact-linked finance. So we actually pioneer this field with some others. And we will hopefully learn today a little bit more what this means. So we are active globally, but what is really exciting to share with you, actually our journey with impact-linked finance started in Latin America in 2016, when we started with the first program, the first SYNC program. You will learn about SYNC in a few minutes. And launched the first open call for proposals all across Latin America in partnership with IDB Lab, Ashoka, New Ventures, and other great partners. And yeah, so we are based in Germany. We have around 15 people, are growing. We are now also active on other continents, in Asia, in Africa. Yeah, that's our business. And we typically work with organizations that can provide catalytic funding used in a very innovative way to encourage a deeper impact. But you will see this in a minute, I guess. Here you see the agenda for the session today. So we want to present 3 ideas to you. The first is money is waiting at the end of the pipeline, which actually means we want to first shed some light into the challenges of impact entrepreneurs to raise investment. The second idea is about deep impact needs more than traditional finance. So what's the reason that we actually come up with new structures? And the idea number 3 is better terms for better impact, which is actually our claim for impact-linked finance. So let's dig directly into the idea number 1. With a simple question, what do 80% or more than 80% of impact enterprises that are serving the bottom of the pyramid have in common? And a study says they all have a pattern, and they all have the same challenge, that they are not operating at scale or near to scale, and are not ready to raise investment. And of course, this also might be common sense, that we are all dealing with enterprises that are lacking access to finance because they are simply not ready to receive this kind of finance. But there's a reason for that, and I would like to go into that. So what we see from a pure, let's say, financial perspective, because investors, of course, have a very specific perspective on these enterprises. And we see that the typical target enterprises we are all most interested in, creating huge social benefits, might not always be a fit for investors because they are simply too risky from their business model, or maybe even from the region they are operating in, compared to the return they can generate, right? So the finance guys talk about the so-called efficiency frontier of investments, which actually means returns and risks need to be in balance. The more risk you take, the more return you need to compensate for that risk. And high impact organizations are simply typically not on this frontier. They are below. So they have higher risk and lower return. And this is, of course, a serious issue. And we always think about, okay, when is an enterprise ready for investors? And we realize that there are many, many impact investors and other investors in emerging and developing markets who are, if we formulate it a bit provocative, who are waiting at the end of the pipeline. And the pipeline is actually what incubators and accelerators do. And the investors are actually just waiting there until these enterprises are ready to raise investment. On a different graph, it looks like that. So between the startup phase and the experimentation and the maturity phase, when they are ready and when they are ready to scale, when they have a proof of concept, there is this quite extensive phase we call the critical stage, or you can also call it the valley of death, the missing middle, and there are many, many terms that can be used for that stage. And this stage is absolutely critical for many, many enterprises who are in this double bottom line business. Because in this stage, they are simply too large for grants and also for microfinance, but they are by far too small and also too risky for getting access to institutional investors. And of course, I'm generalizing here a bit. There are always exemptions, but this is just a pattern in the market that there is this critical stage we need to overcome. And we need also to find solutions to overcome it. And you also see that these enterprises do not only generate direct impact, if they are able to scale and come across this critical stage, they will also have a lot of indirect impact, replications that they can inspire others to do it similarly, etc., etc. So when we look into these challenges, we found some solutions to address this from the finance side, and Patricia will go into that.
Thanks, Björn. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us so early. Let's talk about why deep impact needs more than traditional finance. So if we look, we discussed a little bit like what are the challenges of impact enterprises, right? For them, it's really difficult to attract investment, but what happens at the other side? What do you think is actually the proportion of impact investors who would like or would be willing to sacrifice their returns to see higher levels of impact? Well, studies show that actually this percentage is not as high as we would all like. This is actually a study coming from the GIN, and they do this survey every year, and every year it seems to be getting lower and lower. So basically, impact investors are all there for impact, but actually very, very few would compromise on their returns. And here's where we really started asking ourselves, okay, there is really a mismatch between what impact enterprises can offer to investors in terms of returns and how profitable they are. And on the other hand, what impact investors want to see in terms of a risk return profile. If we go to the next slide. So actually what we see is that the special thing about impact enterprises is that it's not they do not create any financial value. They have a business model, but this financial value that they generate is not as high as the one of a traditional enterprise. And this is what we call a commercial viability gap. So there is some financial value being created. At the same time, there is this huge social value being created that they're not able to capture in market prices. Because if you're selling a product or service to the poorest of the poor, of course, you cannot charge the prices you would charge to a middle or high income person. And so this is where there is social value created, which is not monetized into what the company is selling as a product or service. And there is this limited financial value created. And so out of all these considerations, we really asked ourselves, if we go to the next slide, what if, those social returns that are there and that we can see and that we really recognize as being something very important, what if they really mattered for business? What if they can, turn around the business and make it finally a highly profitable and highly scalable solution? And what if, entrepreneurs could actually get remunerated for this social value that today they're not really paid for? And so out of this thinking is how we really came up to the idea of social impact incentives. So this was one of our first articles when we launched in the program in Latin America, with the idea of saying, actually we could find public funders or philanthropic funders who are really interested in giving value to this impact that is being created and paying for it. And so let's find a way of, creating an innovative financial mechanism to do so and to then target the impact that we are really interested in seeing. And so this can be anything, increasing access to certain products or services to the BOP, reaching the last mile, also focusing on certain gender indicators. It can be very targeted in many different ways. And the way it works really, and this is also why we love the idea of working with impact enterprises, what actually we are contributing to is just this tiny delta, which is just enough for the enterprise to really be able to finally cover its costs with its revenues and start scaling. And by doing so, by adding this additional revenue stream, because this is what it is at the end of the day, the enterprise becomes more profitable, and hence it's able to attract investment easier than it was before. And at the same time, it can finally focus on the impact mission and somehow overcome the many tensions that impact entrepreneurs are experiencing between their business model and their impact objectives. I would like to give an example so that it maybe will all start making more sense. So a few years ago, we met Incamos, which is a social enterprise from Peru that works with indigenous communities living in the Andes. And they were really trying to find a way of providing a livelihood to these remote communities. And so the problem was really that people who were living in the mountains, they didn't have any ways of generating revenues, and they were living in extreme poverty. And what this company does is actually harvesting and packaging moss. Moss is this fluffy thing growing on the mountains that is actually amazing for the orchid industry, because it has very good water retention, and so orchids grow just beautifully with this moss. But hey, you can actually harvest it in the mountains and then be able to sell it internationally, because the orchid industry is great. And so if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is basically the explanation of what the company does, but they really found a way of collaborating with those remote communities, teaching them how to harvest properly this moss, and then the company itself would take care of the distribution and the sale of this internationally. And so right now, Incamos works with 350 Andean families, and it's still growing. And by the way, they also raised recently $600,000 US. So they were also looking to scale and looking for repayable investment to do so. And so what we figured out with them and decided to incentivize them for is to, on one hand, increase their impact. So straight away reach more indigenous communities. And then at the same time, we were looking to ensure there is a higher income for the harvesters. So really making sure that this increase in their income would be, significant to allow them a better livelihood. And so you can see on the right-hand side, we identified basically 3 metrics, but they were all related to, increasing the impact, reaching more communities, which is very difficult to do because they're really, really far away and very difficult to go on the top of a mountain and then find a new community. And at the same time, making sure that once a community starts working with Incamos, they are getting better and they're producing more, and so they're earning more. And yeah, we started this in 2018, and I think at the end of this year, we will finally complete the whole life cycle of the sink, and we will be able to harvest the full results. And similar to this one example, actually, we closed already since 2016, several transactions, and we have also a few in preparation right now. And yes, we started in Latin America, but actually right now we are working in Africa, in Asia, in many different sectors, really ranging from healthcare to employment and education to WASH. Just to explain how it works, because maybe some of you could think, oh, but this is complicated. No, it's actually quite straightforward, because what really happens is that we have 2 contracts in place. On one hand, you have an outcome payer. So it can be a public funder, a foundation, someone who really cares about impact, that signs a contract with the enterprise saying, I'm really interested in you achieving these outcomes and I'm willing to pay this much for it. And regularly, the outcomes are being verified and then the outcome payer pays the money to the enterprise. And on the other side, you have the impact enterprise also raising a round of investment from an investor. And so the other contract is between the 2. So if some of you are familiar with the social impact bond model, this is different in a sense that the contracts are separate and the parties are separate. And also what is maybe useful to mention is that we do not have any predefined investor that we want the enterprise to engage with. And also any forms of repayable investment actually qualify as this investment component, because we really think that it should be up to the enterprise to decide with whom they want to enter into an investment agreement with. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, so that was just the explanation. What does it take to actually do a sync? So when we look at the enterprises, we really seek a strong evidence for impact on disadvantaged target groups. So someone who really knows how to work with vulnerable populations, because this is what we are really interested in supporting most of the time. Of course, it depends on the focus we have. We really are interested in seeing a scalability potential. So enterprises that can go to scale and over time also become commercially self-sustainable, or that are able to enter into public contracting, because there are also cases where certain services are considered essential, and so you could have a government willing to pay then the enterprise for it. Also very important is to have always direct and measurable outcomes or proxies. So enterprises that really value data are our favorite, just because it's just so much easier to build the metrics and understand how far the enterprise can go. And yeah, you really need data to be able to understand also your impact, right? And finally, what Sync is really trying to do is to address this market failure where, at least at the beginning for a young impact enterprise, there is a clear tension between being more commercially attractive and basically generating more revenues and on the other hand, creating more and deeper impact. So again, it's this question like, can I reach more vulnerable people or should I go for the low hanging fruits? And we see this tension over and over again. And what we are trying to do here is to overcome this tension by paying the enterprise for something that usually they are not paid for, and something that makes them usually less profitable. And the hope, of course, over time is that with the company scaling and being able to really specialize in serving a certain group, they're also able to gain from those economies of scale, become more efficient over time. So they're able to create that same impact also after the sync payments are gone. So this was idea 2. Are there any questions so far?
Patricia, perhaps because in Latin America, at least, these social impact bonds have become more popular. So I think a lot of people already know or have a fair understanding. So it would be interesting to know what is the difference in one first hand. And then if you can tell more, if you go back to that slide where you have the diagram, where you show how it works. Also, if you can tell us usually who are all these different type of stakeholders. So if you, I guess if the outcome payers are always philanthropical, or you also find other types of investors, governments, and if you can just explain a little bit of how the different dynamics between different stakeholders work.
Absolutely. I will start from the first one, the difference with the social impact bond. So just as a general idea, what happens with the social impact bond is that the whole structure is set up with an existing investor that is going to finance a certain intervention up front. In this case, we have 2 separate contractual agreements where you have the outcome payer actually paying only for the impact portion of what they're interested in, instead of, in the case of the social impact bond, the government paying for the whole intervention if it happens to be successful. So, you know, this delta that was shown in the other graph. So it's really about contributing this one portion. And why is that? Because we want to work with enterprises that have a business model that are generating revenues. And very often in social impact bonds, you have those service providers that often are more NGOs that may have some sort of revenues, but primarily rely on these funders that would pay for their programs. And after, you know, the program is finished, they need to look for the next one. So we are really looking for those type of business models. Björn, would you like to add a couple of more points on the difference?
Yeah, so I think the sync model is closer to carbon finance than to impact bonds. Of course, we get this question very, very often because we use similar terminology, right? We are also outcomes based. However, in carbon finance, there is a simple principle that if you generate or if you can prove that you are reducing emissions with your solution, then you can certify and then you get paid for that, right? Then it's just natural that you generate revenues from this value you create actually for the environment. And we just wanted to do something similar for the rest of the SDGs, right? There are so many other issues we need to tackle and where we could provide rewards for. And I think the whole thinking was inspired by impact bonds when we started in 2016 to implement this model the first time in LATAM. However, we also realized businesses need something different than impact bonds, as Patricia just said. I would also mention, because there was the question of who's typically paying that, right? That I just realized that I missed to mention the most important player in our first program, which was the Swiss Development Corporation, the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation, which was the funder of the program. Without them, without an outcome funder, this model is not possible. There needs to be always, we call them catalytic funders. It does not necessarily need to be a public entity. It can also be a private foundation. but a pure interest in impact and not necessarily in financial return. We will come later to hybrid models where you can combine both. But for SYNC, it needs somebody who is typically a grant maker, but wants to use the grant in a more targeted and we hope in a more effective way by leveraging a business to actually generate the impact we are looking at.
Thank you. I think we have three other questions, Tanya, Pablo, and Roberto. And I would like to add, Bjorn, that probably those outcome payers are the ones we try to cater the most in our community, which are those investors for impact, which prioritize impact. So I think this is why, the reason why we believe this was such an important topic for our members. So Tanya, please go ahead.
Bjorn just answered my question, so thank you, Alan.
Okay. Pablo and then Roberto.
Yes, I want to ask you because you mentioned, as in the case of the moss gathering, your metrics were basically the income generation, et cetera, for those villagers. But there are, in this case and in many other cases that have to do with the environment, environmental impacts. Specifically with respect to moss, for example, there is a very big environmental impact. How do you follow up on the beneficiaries taking into account all those other impacts that may be negative at the same time as they have a positive economic impact?
Do you want to take this one, Bjorn?
Well, I can start. First of all, we were, in the case of Inca moss, we were aware that there could be a negative impact environmentally, but happily, it's the opposite. So what typically happens in these communities, if they wouldn't harvest moss, they would go for farming potatoes and other things. And for that, they would actually burn down the moss in these areas. So we found out that the environmental impact seems to be rather positive in this specific case. However, in other cases, there could be other negative impacts. And what we are looking at is a balance that is net positive, of course. So we don't want to damage on the other side, right? We do a proper assessment of the entire operation of the enterprise. And then, and this is important for the SYNC then, we need to focus on 2 or 3 metrics, which are most relevant in this specific case, and also for the funder. So the SDC, as the main funder of this program, is still most interested in income generation for the bottom of the pyramid, right? But yeah, this is definitely something to be considered. Also think about gender, like what kind of impacts can we influence when it comes to gender related outcomes, equality, etc. There's always the need actually at the end of such or in the middle of such a structuring of a transaction to decide for the most relevant metrics to reward the enterprise for.
Roberto.
Rodolfo, maybe
Yes.
the chat question?
So, sorry, no, I had my microphone in. I'm probably jumping ahead of something that Patricia is going to explain later, but I'm very interested in knowing a little bit more about the verifier, because I would like to know what type of actor the verifier is, who decides who the verifier is, and who bears the cost of verification, because I believe that one of the key elements for the outcome payer and for the financing in general is the idea that the impact has to be true impact, verifiable, comparable, etc., etc. So I would be very interested to learn a little bit more about the role of the verifier, who that actor is, and who you have worked with that you believe is a good actor for that particular role.
So verification, of course, is very important. We work with independent verifiers, meaning that we don't do verification ourselves, otherwise there will be a conflict. We set up certain metrics with the idea of representing the donor, and then, you know, we check all the, no, we have to have someone external doing it. So we facilitate rather the process, but the idea is really to do two things. First of all is to see the operations on the ground, whether, you know, what is claimed to be happening. So additional communities harvesting moss, harvesters actually earning a better income is happening. Are there operations in place? We talk to the harvesters, try to understand all of this part, whether it's really happening. And then there is another check that we do, which is around the system, like the data collection system. So, you know, in this case, it's probably more effective to verify it by going on site, but there are also certain cases where we just have to verify from a database, you know, what are the information that are being collected. So we are very strict in checking whether there is a system in place that can give us sufficient confidence that these things are really happening, that these people are really being employed, supported, receiving additional income, and so on. So this is what we do in terms of costs. So when we typically set up a program, such as the first one we did in Latin America, we have a certain part of the budget that is dedicated to the verification. And the thing is, we are not perfect, meaning that we don't spend $50,000 on verification. Otherwise, no outcome payer would work with us. But we try to find a middle ground where, you know, we can be confident about the outcomes that are happening. The data that we are collecting are good quality data. At the same time, we won't run a randomized control trial because it takes a lot of time. Not everyone can afford it. And we really want to create a win-win situation for everyone. I hope that helps to explain a little bit how we go about it.
Concretely, because we discussed about Inca moss, there was a field researcher visiting the communities, checking, as Patricia said, the data gathering process and doing sample checks whether this data is correct, reflecting reality. So cross-checking with actually the harvesters. Hey, is this right that you did sell 3 sacks in May? And then also looking at qualitative criteria, which are actually not directly related to the metrics, because we really want to understand beyond the 2 or 3 metrics we are rewarding what is happening in these communities. And sometimes we learn a lot like from this qualitative review, where you just have open eyes and observe what's going on. And yeah, but as Patricia said, definitely also a trade-off, right? The more money you spend, the more you learn, but you cannot spend too much money just on that.
Patricia, there's a couple of questions on the chat. I think some of them are very easy to reply on the chat. I'm not sure if, because of the interest of time, we should move on.
Yeah,
and then those
I
that
agree.
you feel, those that
I will
you feel,
do so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So right now we are going to move to the part around impact-linked finance. So Björn, if you can take that one, and I will go through the questions and try to, you know, answer as much as possible. See?
Yeah. So Sync was actually the start of this idea. Impact enterprises should be rewarded for the value they create for society with hard dollars or hard pesos or whatever currency we use. And then over time, we realized, hey, there are other ways to do that. So if we would be the investor, not the outcome. Right now in Sync, right, we so far did represent the outcome payer and the interest of the outcome payer. But if we would be the investor and we would have the opportunity to be super patient and super flexible with the assets we would manage, then we could also build this in the financial instruments we use. So then it would not be entrepreneurs being paid for their impact, then it's really being rewarded in a different way. And it's not, actually, we did not invent this. This did already happen before we started to, let's say, coin this term, make it more, let's say, systematic. So our friends from Beneficial Returns, maybe some of you know Ted Levinson, who is active in Latin America since a long time. He is doing that. So he provides incentives to businesses in Latin America for the impact they generate. He has a very simple methodology. He's just waiving, he's a lender to these enterprises, and he agrees on certain impact targets. And if these targets are met, then he waives the last payment of the loan, which is a clear incentive for the enterprise to achieve these targets. So what we actually, based on this whole idea of rewarding achieving of outcomes and being very, very explicit on that, what we did is, hey, thinking about how can we build this principle into any financial instrument, across the whole spectrum of finance, which is actually nothing else than providing better terms for better impact, right? And we see this from a theoretical perspective as a hybrid model of blended finance, impact investing, and results-based finance. It shares characteristics of all these practices, and it can be implemented in various ways. Here you just see a few examples. So we first started to structure sinks in a different way. So we found that there are some enterprises who have quite good potential to be super profitable in the future. Maybe right now they are super risky and super, they work in a super volatile environment. But if they are through this critical stage, maybe in 5, 6, 7 years, they will be quite profitable, and they can probably even pay back what we provided. And this is in particular true for tech-enabled enterprises with a typical hockey stick, right? And for these, we started to structure reimbursable sink or convertible. This is somehow similar. And there could, for example, be a trigger for this reimbursement, which is profitability. Like when you reach a certain level of profitability, then you have to start paying back. This is a way also to bring in some discipline into this. For some ventures, not for every. And then there are other models. For example, the most, let's say the simplest model you can imagine is an impact-linked loan. And an impact-linked loan is simply reducing the interest rate. Like if you achieve certain targets, which should be based on outcomes, then we commit, you have to pay less interest. Or even we could, I will show you an example, we could even forgive the principal or parts of the principal of the loan. And the same you can do with revenue share agreements. So we love revenue share agreements, and entrepreneurs love revenue share agreements as well, because they're so much more flexible than loans with fixed interest rates and fixed repayment. And in this case, we can also just lower the repayment cap, or let's say the amount enterprises have to pay back based on achieving of impact. That's the whole idea. And all of these instruments are rewarding entrepreneurs for their impact and are lowering their financing costs. That's the idea, right? And here you see a little bit how an impact-linked loan works. So in this case, there's no outcome funder. There is just an investor. This could be a typical member of Latin Pacto, like investing for impact, right? Also willing to actually provide rewards, maybe with a clear ceiling, like, hey, at least I need to earn the inflation rate, right? But everything above could be linked to impact. Like we start with 10% and we go down up to 3.5% if certain impact targets are met. This is the whole idea. And there are many, many clauses in loan contracts where we could link the impact to. And then there would, of course, again, need to be a verification. Like all the rest is quite similar to a sync contract. Interestingly, we are also right now implementing this model in Latin America as a response to COVID, to help impact enterprises to actually go through this pandemic and stay on track, delivering impact to the ones who need it most. Because in particular, in these times of crisis, double bottom line businesses, there is, of course, a high risk that they just do everything to make money and survive, right? And in these cases, rewards for impact can really make a huge difference for them. So in this specific program in LATAM, we again partner with the Swiss Development Corporation, and they even compensate the investors for all rewards the investors would provide. So it's then a blended finance model where the investors are backed by a donor. And in this specific case, we even forgive parts of the loan for impact. So up to 30% of the principal amount of the loan are forgiven for achieving impact. And this really makes a big difference for some of these enterprises. Patricia, I want to show you one of these cases in this specific program.
Yes, I am responding to everyone, but I will stop for now and go into the case of Gravity, which is a company from Mexico that we supported recently via the emergency loan program that we did. And what Gravity does is actually providing access to home appliances, such as, for example, a water heater that you see in this photo, to people who are typically unbanked and don't, they cannot buy those type of appliances on credit. So on the next slide, you can see really the extent of the problem. Not only in Mexico, but overall in Latin America, there are over 100 million families that lack access to basic services and appliances. And it was really shocking to see how big is this problem and how little of a market penetration certain very common appliances have in these countries. And so what Gravity saw as an opportunity was connecting those unbanked families with those appliances that they needed via a buy now, pay later solution. And so they analyze really the consumer data, and it's basically a pay-go model to be able to repay their product. They provide these products also without any guarantee from the consumer. So it's really very, very targeted to the base of the pyramid population. And the company started actually a couple of years ago, and now they have reached over 1,300 families. What we seek to incentivize with Gravity through this loan was to push Gravity to increase their reach to the most vulnerable population. So these are the people who are ranked as category C or below in Mexico. and also to maintain an excellent after-sales service. So we did it by looking at the Net Promoter Score that gives a good indication of whether the company is really living up to its promise, not only to deliver a product, but also to help their customers if they have a problem or if they're not able to pay and so on. And so it's, if you want, a little bit similar. We always have this attention towards reaching a certain target population and then a more qualitative metric. And in this case, we were looking at the Net Promoter Score. And the way it works with the loan, I'm sorry, I don't know whether Björn explained it before, but basically they took a loan from Vivala, which is an investor in Mexico. And it's actually a revenue-based sharing agreement. And so with this forgivable component, there is a total loan forgiveness of up to 30% if the enterprise is able to reach those metrics. Björn, do you have anything to add on this?
No, just to make it concrete, what the role now of the Swiss Development Corporation was. They are now just compensating Vivala for this part of the loan, right? So if Vivala would actually really need to forgive on 30% of the principal plus the return, then the SDC is just offsetting this. And then Vivala is neutral, like they make their business as always. And SDC would actually have the opportunity to catalyze this impact because SDC is a grant maker. They have the chance either to do it like that or to do it in a different way. And they see that this is a highly effective way of catalyzing impact, in particular in these times of the pandemic.
By the way, I was also scrolling through the questions and I saw actually more of a comment from Chris Patterson from Root Capital, who was also describing that they benefited from a sync. And it's also a little bit of a different structure there because they are an investor. But when we look at the different positions, we looked at them as an impact enterprise. So I don't want to go into details on Root Capital if that is not relevant now, but if we have some extra time, also happy to share more details on how that went, because actually it was a great success story for everyone from there. There was a lot of other great things that happened, and we were able to do like a second sync because we really saw great results. So in case we have more time, happy to talk a bit more about it. But let's go to the lessons learned. I think this is also super interesting in terms of what we have learned in the past 5 years, and also what we are really interested in sharing with those who are interested in really starting to look into impact-linked finance and also become practitioners of impact-linked finance. So the very first thing, it sounds obvious, but we really need for every enterprise that wants to benefit from sync or impact-linked finance to have a good impact measurement and management practice. And so we have been also over time doing a lot of effort in terms of creating programs that also cover that part. So we have a program in Bangladesh that also does investment readiness and impact management, because we see these are the two key components. Something very important to mention that when we design those transactions, this is a co-creation process really. So we have a lot of exchanges with the enterprise to really understand what could be the best approach and the most tailored approach for them to allow them to really reach their full impact potential. We also learned that having more sector-specific programs is very helpful because it allows to better compare the companies. Someone was mentioning comparability, I think at some point, and it's true, like when you're in the same sector, you can start thinking, what are the general outcomes I would like to achieve? And also this helps bringing the overall transaction costs down when it comes to the structuring. And also thinking ahead, we know that technology will play a big role in enabling, on one hand, better impact measurement, and also accelerating the practice of linking finance to impact. And what we really value the most and what we see is really special about these transactions that are being built is this idea of understanding where is the additionality, meaning what wouldn't have happened otherwise if we didn't enter into this agreement, if we weren't able to support the enterprise on this specific outcome. And so we also saw that over time, additionality can take many different forms. You can talk about impact additionality, you can talk about financial additionality. And really every time we try to look at an enterprise without any judgment and just say, okay, where is it that we can be really additional in this case? And last but not least, the first solution that we were talking about, social impact incentive, is only one tool of this huge toolkit, which is impact-linked finance, which is really about giving impact rewards and integrating them in any financial instrument. And so this is a bit what we have learned in this journey. I would like to move maybe to the next slide. I don't remember. Okay, this is what comes next. I will stop here to check if there are any questions that we didn't answer. I don't know if I was fast enough. Yeah, maybe before we move on, what is the interest rate for gravity? I don't remember. I'm sorry, I would have to check our documents.
I think so. Vivala has a super standardized way of working because they do quite small transactions. And I'm not entirely sure. It's above 10%. Something, yeah. No, I'm also not entirely sure.
Yeah, I don't want to say something which may not be correct. I see there is one question: what is the general view on using blockchain as technology for lowering the costs and providing more transparency? Moreover, what is the view on using crypto as an investing vehicle? So on blockchain, the answer is indeed there are certain characteristics of blockchain that can help. The fact of using smart contracts to have an escrow, and then once certain contracts are verified, you pay out. So definitely it's something that we are already thinking about. Using cryptocurrencies, you can, but there are also other ways that it can work. So I am a bit less enthusiastic about that one. Okay, then I would suggest to check out what's next. So Alan promised at the beginning of the session that we had a little offer, surprise. So if you found this session interesting and you think that impact-linked finance is something that you and your organization would really like to approach more closely, we have created a bootcamp on impact-linked finance, where we really structured a program specifically designed for public funders and philanthropic and catalytic funders to help you understand really how impact-linked finance works and how you could employ it and adapt it to your own organization. And there is actually, we thought of having actually a selection process to do so, because we want to have a really targeted group of people with, let's say, similar objectives, so that we can really have a very effective session. It's going to be a program spanning over 3 months. I think on the next slide, we have more or less how the program is designed. So it's built into 3 sessions. More of a general part to align and, let's say, be sure of where we stand in terms of fundamentals. Then the second part, it's really about impact-linked finance. So how to design transactions, what are the do's and don'ts throughout the whole life cycle of a transaction. And finally, we also thought of giving the opportunity to have one-on-one sessions to really discuss a real life case. So we expect the participants to possibly come with, you know, an organization that they were planning to support, and we can try to design together how an impact-linked finance transaction would look like. Oh, I think Roberta is mentioning proof of impact. We are actually talking to them. So they're the ones, definitely, yeah. So good recommendation, I would say. In terms of who can apply for the bootcamp, so please check the selection criteria. We can forward you the link where you can find all the information on how it works. The timeline, it's going to start at the end of August and run for 3 months. The dates for this, let's say, different sessions are still to be defined. And then very, very important, we have this questionnaire or survey to apply. So if you're interested in participating in this bootcamp, you have to fill out the survey before the 5th of July so that we are able also to give you swift feedback. And then we will start at the end of August. It's not written here, but there is a fee of $100. This is mostly because we really want to make sure that whoever wants to participate really stays committed to the program. We believe there is a lot of value in it, but actually it is funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. They are really supporting our efforts also in spreading impact-linked finance and helping other organizations put it into practice. So this is how we were able to make it really so cheap. Bjorn, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think this was of course worth to mention. This is quite an effort we put into this. It's not to sell you something, it's really to offer you something, which is paid. However, we need a bit of a discipline with this $100 as a kind of filter that we avoid that it's simply not effective and it does not lead to concrete action. So concrete action, which would really mean to look at your portfolio. Do I potentially have a candidate or somebody in the pipeline where I could actually apply these concepts? This would be the perfect situation because we know that it's about practicing it and not just about talking about it and having some theory about it. We would be super happy to support you in that. So as Roots of Impact, we see ourselves not just as practitioners who are implementing, also as an organization who is actively advocating for changing the financial system, actually. And this is part of it, that more and more practitioners are applying impact-linked finance. And just consider how this in 20 years could look like. Yeah, without being too bold and too visionary, but think about really a financial system that would provide very, very low cost capital to the most impactful organizations. This is a bit the idea.
I just saw one comment from...
Yeah, there's 2 comments, and the government, there's 2 people wanting to know if government officials, government agencies can also apply to the bootcamp. And
so I would say yes. Then in practice, we would need to understand whether there are any specific regulations within the ministry on whether they could actually put it into practice. So I would suggest, you know, also based on this presentation, whether you think that you could be able to structure something like this would be quite important, because if we realize, you know, there are certain procurement rules or just certain things cannot be done. But if you have done a SIP, then I'm pretty sure you can do anything else. So I think the level of complexity is much lower with a SINC or with an impact-linked finance transaction.
I don't know if anybody wants to open up their mic for last questions before we close. Any other questions? feel free to make them directly to Bjorn or Patricia. Don't be shy. Manolo.
Hello, Bjorn and Patricia. Thank you for this impressive presentation. I mean, really an eye-opener. By the way, I'm calling directly from Mexico City. And the question I have for you, and given the fact that I have studied associative economics a la Rudolf Steiner, I was wondering if, with your experiences in providing this model and these incentives, if this could be, or if you have seen it has already happened to be, a transition towards internalizing in prices social, economic, and environmental impact. I don't know if I express myself correctly and if you get the question, but you know, given that we're pushing for a new and more just economy, I mean, I see this as the perfect transition towards that. So can you share your thoughts?
Yeah, happy to start. As an economist, yeah, economists immediately get what we are doing. It's about externalities, right? So typically businesses do act within the framework they have, right? And so far in this framework, in the regulations, they didn't have to pay for damage they create for the environment. And this is how carbon finance came in. But there's so much more than just carbon, right? There are other damages. And there are also positive effects. So we talk about positive and negative externalities. So interestingly, we as Roots of Impact and some of our friends, we are just doing finance, right? But we are not doing, let's say, business as a whole, like for example, accounting standards. There are others who are working on accounting standards and they try to incorporate the impact of businesses entirely in the accounting system of businesses. This is even more sophisticated than anything we talked about today, right? So we are just pragmatic because we have a certain scope, what we can influence, right? In the practice of financing high impact organizations. We would love to see not only rewards, but also penalties. But this is not our task, right? This is a political task. Yeah, so I think there's a movement. It's unfortunately, it's a power play, right? Between very different interest groups. It's very, very much not only, but very, very much driven by, let's say, the issue of climate change. But again, climate change is an extremely important issue, as biodiversity is, as gender is, as many, many other topics are. And this is definitely something where there is a movement, a slow movement, and where we could hopefully make a difference. And our approach, as we are practitioners and not in policy, maybe at some point we will end up in policy, but our approach is actually demonstrating that this is possible, right? On a rather smaller scale. So our transactions are not, we are not moving big corporates or global companies, right? We are working with local entities and enterprises. We want to demonstrate what is possible to reward positive externalities, to give also some ideas how to scale this up on a more general level. Oh, nice to see.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you. I appreciate it, Bjorn.
Thanks.
Well, if there's no more questions, I think Bjorn, Patricia, thank you very much. I think this is a great case study on how Latimpacto seeks to work with partners such as yourself, where we can share ideas, inspire others, and then also provide practical training, so it doesn't really just stay in theory. So again, thank you very much. I'm very excited to move on with seeing how we will see at the end of the year, or maybe early next year, some case studies based on the bootcamp and this. So very excited to see what happens. And hopefully in 1 year, we'll be presenting those case studies in this community. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining as well. And have a good day.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. And
thank you.
Take care. See you soon.
Thank you very much. Very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you once again.
Bye.